Ted Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. His early life was marked by confusion and secrecy. Raised by his grandparents, Bundy was led to believe that his mother was his sister. This deception was revealed to him in his teenage years, which some speculate could have contributed to his later issues with identity and morality. His biological mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, moved with him to Tacoma, Washington, when he was a toddler, where she later married Johnny Bundy, giving Ted his infamous surname. As a child, Bundy was described as intelligent and charming, but socially awkward. He had difficulty forming meaningful relationships and often felt out of place. However, he managed to put on a facade of normalcy, which allowed him to blend into society later as an adult. Bundy studied psychology at the University of Washington, where he excelled academically and developed an interest in law and politics. His political ambitions led him to volunteer in several Republican campaigns, and he even worked closely with high-ranking political figures. In the early 1970s, Bundy seemed to have a promising future ahead of him. Yet beneath his charming and successful exterior lurked a dark and sadistic personality. Bundy began his killing spree in the mid-1970s, though some suspect he started earlier. His victims were typically young women, many of them college students, with long hair parted down the middle. Bundy used his good looks and intelligence to lure these women, often pretending to be injured or incapacitated to elicit sympathy. He would approach them in public places, asking for help to carry books or unload items into his car. Once they were close enough, Bundy would overpower them, often using a blunt object to knock them unconscious before abducting and killing them. Bundy's methods were calculated and cruel. After abducting his victims, he would often take them to secluded locations where he raped, tortured, and murdered them. Some of his victims were strangled, while others were beaten to death. Bundy's behavior escalated to include necrophilia, as he would return to the bodies of his victims and engage in sexual acts with their corpses long after they had died. He would also mutilate their bodies and keep parts of his victims, such as their heads, as trophies. Bundy admitted to decapitating at least 12 of his victims. In 1974, young women began disappearing in the Pacific Northwest, and the authorities noticed a disturbing pattern. Police were baffled by the sudden surge of missing women, but Bundy's name didn't initially come up. He managed to evade suspicion by maintaining a respectable front. He had a steady girlfriend, Elizabeth Klopfer, who described him as charming, kind, and loving, unaware of his double life. Bundy continued his killing spree, moving from state to state to avoid detection. His crimes extended beyond Washington into Utah, Colorado, Idaho, and even as far as Florida. In August 1975, Bundy's reign of terror almost came to an end when he was arrested in Utah after fleeing from a police officer who had attempted to pull him over for a minor traffic violation. The officer found suspicious items in Bundy's car, including handcuffs, a crowbar, and a ski mask. While this led to Bundy's arrest, he managed to evade serious charges by using his charisma and knowledge of the law to manipulate the system. He was briefly imprisoned but escaped in 1977 while awaiting trial for the kidnapping of Carol Duranch, a woman who had miraculously escaped from him. Bundy's first escape occurred when he was allowed to visit the courthouse library to research his own defense. Taking advantage of the lax security, he jumped from a second-story window and fled. After 8 days on the run, he was recaptured, only to escape again a few months later. This time, he managed to break out of the Garfield County Jail in Colorado by sawing a hole in the ceiling of his cell. Bundy's second escape would lead to one of the most brutal episodes in his criminal career. In January 1978, after making his way to Florida, Bundy committed one of the most infamous attacks in his murderous career. He broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee and attacked 4 women, killing 2 of them, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, while severely injuring the other 2. His method of entry was typical of his impulsive nature. He simply walked through an unlocked door. He bludgeoned his victims with a piece of firewood, strangled them, and sexually assaulted Levy. Immediately after the Chi Omega killings, Bundy attacked another woman, Cheryl Thomas, in her home, leaving her with permanent injuries. Despite his attempts to cover his tracks, Bundy's time on the run was coming to an end. His final arrest came in February 1978, when he was stopped by police in Pensacola, Florida, while driving a stolen car. He initially gave a false name but eventually confessed his true identity. By this time, Bundy was one of the most wanted men in the country, and his arrest made national headlines. Even after being captured, Bundy continued to use his intelligence and charm to manipulate those around him. He acted as his own defense attorney during his trial for the Chi Omega murders, cross-examining witnesses and attempting to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. His courtroom antics drew widespread media attention, and Bundy relished being in the spotlight. During the trial, Bundy even proposed to his former girlfriend, Carol Ann Boone, while she was on the witness stand. They later had a daughter together while Bundy was on death row. Bundy's trial for the Chi Omega murders was a media spectacle. Cameras were allowed in the courtroom, and Bundy seemed to thrive on the attention. He continued to maintain his innocence, even as overwhelming evidence, including bite marks that matched his teeth, was presented against him. Bundy was ultimately convicted of the murders and sentenced to death. However, his legal battles were far from over. He continued to appeal his conviction, and even offered to confess to more murders in exchange for delaying his execution. As Bundy's appeals dragged on, he began to confess to more and more murders, ultimately admitting to killing at least 30 women across 7 states between 1974 and 1978. However, many believe that the actual number of Bundy's victims is much higher. His confessions were often vague and inconsistent, leaving many questions about the full extent of his crimes. Bundy's ability to compartmentalize his life allowed him to maintain relationships with people who had no idea about his double life as a sadistic killer. His long-term girlfriend, Elizabeth Klopfer, remained unaware of his crimes for years, although she did become suspicious at certain points. Klopfer even contacted the police to report her concerns, but they initially dismissed her claims due to Bundy's respectable appearance and social standing. As Bundy's execution date drew closer, he finally began to open up about the extent of his crimes. In the days leading up to his execution, Bundy gave interviews to several psychologists and criminologists, attempting to explain his behavior. He attributed his violent tendencies to a combination of factors, including his exposure to violent pornography, his feelings of inadequacy, and a desire for power and control over his victims. However, many experts believe that Bundy's explanations were self-serving and failed to fully account for the depth of his depravity. Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison on January 24, 1989. Outside the prison, crowds gathered to celebrate his death, holding signs that read, "Burn, Bundy, burn," and chanting in celebration. Bundy's execution marked the end of one of the most infamous chapters in American criminal history, but his legacy continues to haunt the public consciousness. Bundy's case has sparked widespread interest and debate among psychologists, criminologists, and law enforcement professionals. His ability to lead a double life, appearing charming and respectable while committing horrific acts of violence, has led to ongoing discussions about the nature of psychopathy and the motivations of serial killers. Bundy is often cited as a textbook example of a psychopath, someone who lacks empathy and is able to manipulate and exploit others without remorse. His charisma and intelligence allowed him to blend into society, making him all the more dangerous. Even those who knew him well were shocked to learn about his crimes, as he had carefully crafted an image of himself as a kind, intelligent, and successful man. Bundy's case also raised important questions about the criminal justice system and the ways in which law enforcement handled serial killers in the 1970s. At the time, police departments across the country did not have the technology or communication networks to easily share information, which allowed Bundy to move from state to state without raising suspicion. It wasn't until the 1980s that advances in forensic science, such as DNA testing, began to make it easier for law enforcement to track down serial killers. Bundy's case highlighted the need for better coordination between police departments and the importance of psychological profiling in identifying and apprehending serial killers. Bundy's life and crimes have been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films, reflecting society's enduring fascination with him. His case continues to be studied in criminology courses, and his name remains synonymous with the concept of the charming, intelligent psychopath. Despite his efforts to control the narrative of his life, Bundy's crimes speak for themselves, revealing a man who was capable of unimaginable cruelty and violence. He remains one of the most notorious serial killers in history, a figure who exploited the trust and compassion of his victims to carry out his sadistic fantasies. In the years since Bundy's death, his crimes have continued to cast a long shadow over American culture. His case has been used as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting appearances and the ways